So look, hey, thanks so much for joining. Thanks very much for the invite. It's always really good fun to come and talk to you guys, because you always bring a really interesting view to the world of project management, to the world of change management. So I'm really looking forward to the next hour. And also apologies for being in this rather Christmassy front room. My study at the moment has turned into Santa's workshop and is full of boxes and toys, so I can't actually get in there. So welcome to my front room. Cool. So what we're going to do, so over the next hour, I'm going to talk a little bit about well, very much my opinion of what matters in the world of project management, what matters in the world of change management. I'm sure you're aware that only a fool tries to predict anything. So I'm sure that some of this might come to pass, some of it won't come to pass, but hopefully we can begin a bit of a conversation about the stuff that is going to be impacting all of us in the wider world, in the world of technology, in the world of psychology going forward. As you mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the history, because I'm a massive believer, and you really do need to understand the history of where you've come from to be able to understand where you might be going to. So we're going to talk about 15-20 minutes looking at a bit into the past, what that says about where we are now in the world of project and change management, and then we'll talk a little bit about the future. So without any more waffle, let me crack on. So just so you know who I am, I'm Adam. There's me on the right, looking like a sort of 1970s lecturer. But yes, I'm Director of Controlling at Pay2 Consulting. A couple of other things. So I co-chair the APM's Portfolio Management Committee. I've done a range of stuff around kind of masters, around sort of major programs and the like. So I get quite interested in the research side of project and program management, as well as the practical application. You know, what does it mean to do change on the ground? I work for a company called P2 Consulting. We're about 200 strong. We're a delivery transformation company. So we go into all sorts of companies and help them with all sorts of aspects of their projects and programs and PMO. So let me crack on while we've done that out of the way. Okay, so let's go back in time. Let's go back a long way in time, because actually, you know, project management, change management, actually trying to organize one task after another is one of the earliest jobs out there. And even if you go back to kind of Hammurabi's code, you know, 2000 BC, they are talking about the act of building. They are talking about the act of planning something. And actually, there's a really interesting line in there. It says, if a builder builds a house for a man and does not make its construction firm, and the house which he has built collapses and causes the death of the owner of the house, that builder shall be put to death. I think there's two really interesting aspects there. Number one, they were talking all that time ago about the act of building, the act of kind of essentially project management. But they were also talking about risk. Actually, if you are responsible for this project, this building, and you fail, then your skin is in the game. You are the person who is on the hook for that. And I want to hang on to that, because I'm going to come back to that right at the end when we talk about some of the interesting trends in what we see and how project management is changing in the future. So 2,000 years ago, sorry, 4,000 years ago, apologies, Hammurabi's code talking about builders. Let's jump forward though till the last century. And I always think of the birth of our particular discipline as occurring around about the construction of the Hoover Dam, because that's really when the Gantt chart, which had been around for a bit of time before then, but that's when it really started to grow up. For those who've not seen a Gantt chart is really very simple. It's a task list created in time. So there are a load of things that need to happen, but this thing happens first, this thing happens second, this thing happens third, and so on and so forth. And if you boil down project management to its absolute nub, that's it really. It's trying to get a whole load of tasks, putting them in linear time so you can understand what needs to happen one after another, after another, after another. The Gantt chart, of course, named after Henry Gantt, was the kind of initial stab at trying to put a sort of codified way of doing that. And that came to fruition really in the Hoover Dam. And there's some wonderful, I haven't actually got an image of it here, but there's some wonderful images I've seen of the planning room in the Hoover Dam with these massive, massive Gantt charts sort of all across the wall, basically organizing how they are going to put up one of the greatest construction projects of the past century. So for me, that is really the birth of our modern profession, focused very much on tasks, but tasks ordered in terms of their dependency and ordered in terms of time. The next great leap, or if you like, the next bit where people took that concept and really tried to professionalize it as something separate from the act of building, construction, was actually in the war. And in the war, they started to take a lot of those learnings that they had from kind of construction, and applied it to projects that weren't purely about building something. Obviously, Manhattan Project is a hugely famous project, but they really started to think a bit more about how do you organize very large groups of people to create something that's not necessarily purely about construction. It could be about people doing different things. It could be about a chemistry. It could be about atoms doing different things. The Manhattan Project is a really interesting one, actually, because I think they organized something like 2,000 people, but all in individual silos. So imagine a program, major program, where actually people don't really know what's going on. They don't really know what the final strategy is. They don't really know what they're trying to build. They just know how that they have to do a particular thing in a particular silo. And then you have to construct and build that all together into one combined program of activity. That's kind of what they did in the Manhattan Project. It really is quite a staggering logistical undertaking. We'd, of course, consider that terribly bad practice, of course, because these days we're very committed to everybody having an understanding what the overarching goal is and everybody understanding the journey you'd go on. But it's interesting that actually, if you go back to World War II, you go back to the Manhattan Project, you start to see us moving away from just talking about planning and construction to a project or program, just trying to do more than just build a single thing. And that tended to get codified then, both in terms of a profession, i.e. a group of people separate from pure builders, and in terms of methodologies. And the methodology, the classic methodology you start to see coming out post-war are PERT, which is essentially a way of doing kind of milestone planning, but kind of an early form of sort of critical network analysis, i.e. what needs to happen when, and actually what's the shortest period of time that needs to happen between different milestones. And of course, everyone's favorite at WS, the work breakdown structure, which forms the foundation of so much of what we might think was classic waterfall project and program management. And I mentioned the AAC, it's CE up there, the Association of American Cost, I always have to write this one down, because I always forget it, Cost Estimators, Association of American Cost Estimators, because often they were the first professional body that started to look at project management as a thing beyond just trying to build something. And they started to look at actually how can you use some of these project management techniques to estimate the cost of all of this activity. Interesting aspect of what you start to see from that space is it stops being a very pure activity of this that happens, then this happens, then this happens, and they started to consider estimates. So they started to think about the likelihood of different milestones happening or not happening, the cost impact of those estimates, and therefore started to talk about costs around these major projects in terms of bands of activity. So some really interesting stuff happening after the war to both codify the profession as something different from purely construction activity, and in terms of codifying some of the tools around that goes beyond the simple Gantt chart. And after that, you see a real flourishing in the world of project management, with the birth of good old-fashioned prompt, which really starts to say that project management is an activity. It's more than planning. It's looking at dependencies. It's looking at risk. It's an organizational thing. It's trying to build temporary organization to construct or design a project. And prompt 2 is, of course, the founder, the thing that came before everyone's favorite. Oops, excuse me. Prince. I always mention Prince. I mean, we use Prince 2 these days, but Prince is in some ways the sort of the granddaddy of that classic project management methodology. So whenever I'm talking to people, I say, yes, are you looking for waterfall or are you looking for agile? And they say, well, give us examples. And it's always kind of Prince on the one side and a range of things on the other side we're going to talk about in a second. But Prince for me is the thing that really starts to shape project management and project management methodologies. It's something that we would recognize in the modern age, in the sort of the age we're in now, as a kind of fully formed waterfall approach. I always also mention the PMI's PMBOK. Now, PMI was formed about 10 years before that, I think, the Project Management Institute, and the APM came along a few years after that. But again, the first of the professional bodies that really started to say there is a thing here called project management, and we need to start to try and codify it, and we start to talk about professional excellence, and so on and so forth. Now, there's also something quite interesting that happened around about that time, and that is Scrum. believe it or not, Scrum came out all the way back in 1986. And I'm pretty sure, because I'm talking to BTS, everyone here is pretty familiar with kind of Agile and Agile methodologies. But it's interesting because we tend to think of Agile as a relatively modern or new way of delivering change, delivering projects and programs. I've always found it quite interesting that it's in no way a new way. You know, you can make a very reasonable case that it's been around as long as most of the modern codified ways of doing waterfall project management. So we're going to talk a lot more about Scrum and Agile a bit later, but I find it really interesting that it popped up all that time ago. And even back there, there's a lovely little quote at the bottom there from the new product development game. They're already talking about the difficulties of the waterfall project management approach, the challenges it gives you in terms of having to lock yourself down to a particular endpoint and being uncomfortable around the concept of change. That quote there, by the way, refers to something called the NASA's Phase Program Planning System, which was very much the gold standard of how you did really complex change in the last century. Again, clear links, you see the clear links there from the kind of Polaris and the sort of military activity going in the war to NASA's activity and NASA's attempt to try and codify how you do large-scale complex project management. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention good old Prince 2. Of course, popped out in 1996. So I think there's some really interesting stuff that was going on in the last century, both in terms of starting to look at the major ways of controlling large-scale change, starting to look at change that's more than just putting in place a big construction project, and starting to codify the profession and trying to say, look, there are different roles. There's project manager, there's risk manager, blah, blah, blah. There's different ways of doing this stuff. However, I also think there's something quite interesting about where project management come from. Because if you look at where it came from in the past century, project management was very much an extension of engineering. It very much came out of the world of this is how we build buildings. This is how we plan putting bricks together and creating something. And that drives us to a really interesting place. So if you think of project management, if you think of change management as an engineering issue, as engineering, then change is what we call a complicated problem. That means that if you break the change down into the smallest blocks, you can actually solve it as a problem. You break it down to the smallest constituent parts, and then you can put it back together. So the solution is reductionist, i.e. I'm going to look at a very big building, I'm going to work out how I can construct that building by taking it apart, realizing it's made of bricks, and seeing how all those bricks go together. So if you think of change project management as an engineering problem, you're trying to basically solve it by taking a reductionist and a mechanistic approach. With the real question you're asking is, how can I build widget A better? I already know what widget A is. It's a building, it's a block, it's whatever it is. My challenge as a project manager is how can I build it quicker, cheaper, to higher quality standards. So let's jump forward to this century. And I do think a number of really, really interesting things have happened in this century. Not quite this century, sorry, 99, but managing successful programs came out in 1999. And managing successful programs took a slightly different slant to project management, to change management. Essentially saying, well, look, it's great that you can build this widget, but do we really believe that is what the end customer wanted? That's what the end stakeholder wanted. Do we really believe this is the thing that is going to deliver a value to the end customer? And in a really simplified nutshell, what managing successful programs does is it says, look, there's a load of projects building outputs, building things. The program's job is to make sure all those things come together to deliver a benefit to the customer. It's not good enough as a project manager just to say, you asked for widget A, I have given you widget A. You have to be smart there. You have to say, well, actually, how is this going to deliver a benefit to the end customer? Is it the benefit they want? How can I better shape this thing so I'm delivering more benefits out of it? So managing successful programs and the concept of program management really started to drive this idea of, do we understand what the value that this project is delivering is? How can we make sure what we're doing gives the most value to those stakeholders that we're delivering the project to? Then if you jump forward a bit over 10 years, you get the concept of management of portfolios. Now, again, I say 10 years, this is when it was really codified in MOP, and it had been bubbling around for a number of years before that. But the portfolio management idea is a really interesting one. Portfolio management, sort of one of my kind of heartlands. What portfolio management is trying to do is say, well, that's great that you are building stuff, but are you building the right things for the organization's strategy? Because an organization will never have enough money to deliver all the change it wants to. So how do I make sure I am delivering as much change as I can for the money I've got? In other words, how am I building a portfolio that balances cost to value? Yeah, you also throw risk in there, by the way, these days, but let's talk about cost and value. So what I'm trying to do with portfolio management is saying, great, I know this program now is going to deliver particular stakeholder value, but am I delivering the right value based on the cost I have for the organizational strategy? You start to do a lot of work with the CC to understand what the strategy is, and you align that portfolio to deliver the most of that you can with the money you've got. So we talked about managing stakeholder programs. We, of course, talked about management of portfolios. And of course, our old favorite, Agile. And as I say, I'm slightly talking myself down because I just mentioned that Scrum came around in 1986, but I think we can probably agree that the real heyday of Agile has been in the last sort of 10, 15 or so years. I mean, certainly for me and my career, the last 5 or 6 years has been when Agile's gone really crazy. But what Agile is trying to say is, well, okay, you're trying to deliver something, you're trying to deliver value to the customer, but you're trying to do it in a way that is very structured, is trying to understand all the potential aspects and give us a really clear definition of what we're building and giving me an operating and enterprise architecture and all sorts of stuff before we start to build it. You're then building it in a big chunk in the middle. You're then testing it as one big chunk, and then you drop it out at the end. And that's fraught with issues and challenges and danger. So what Agile is trying to do is essentially saying we need to get value to the customer as fast as we possibly can. And yes, it gets really obsessed about customer value and making sure you're building stuff in small chunks so it's aligned to the customer. But it's also about trying to get that out nice and quickly. Massive tenet of Agile is delivering value in small chunks as rapidly as you can. If you compare the waterfall world of like big stuff going on over kind of long period of times to the Agile world of getting stuff out nice and quickly that's right for the customer, Agile is really driving my mind. Let's try and make decisions really fast, work out if the thing we're building is correct or not. If it's correct, let's do it a lot. If it's not, let's stop and do something else. So there's a couple of really interesting things happening.
Adam, sorry, yes. I was just going to say, Penny Pullman made a comment a few minutes ago, actually, on the previous slide, just saying, I remember working with DSDM in the mid-90s, brackets Agile. So relevant to your point about the heyday obviously is now, but it's been around for quite a while. Yeah,
I find it fascinating. And I mean, if you talk to, if you talk to kind of IT and professionals, that they're very familiar and they've been messing around with it for years. If you talk to the C-suite, they're all getting excited about it in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, particularly when you talk about scaled Agile. But I do find it fascinating. I mean, they almost don't care about the fact that it's been around for 30 years. They feel like it's new now. They feel like it's modern. They feel like it's exciting, and they want to have it now. It's fascinating, really fascinating stuff. So just to jump back into this. So what do I think the last 20 years of project management have been about? I think they've been about a focus on value. I think they've been a focus on whether that's stakeholder value or organizational value. It's very important, and also about kind of trying to move us faster, because faster and smaller deliveries are much, much safer. But all of that drives us to a slightly different place. So if we looked at the last 100 years, we talked about change management as an extension of engineering. I think the last 20 years has been something slightly different. I think it's looked at change management as an extension of product management. What I mean by that is product management as a concept for saying we're building something that is designed to be a product and be shipped to something. So all of a sudden, the end user, what the end user wants from that product, becomes considerably more important over the engineering concepts of how do I plug bits together to create what you like. So you end up in a world where change stops being a complicated problem, starts being a complex problem. What I mean by that is what is right for my projects and my programs is driven by a subjective understanding of what value is. It's whether the C-suite want this thing defines whether what the portfolio should look like. So whether the customer wants this thing defines whether it's right or not. It doesn't really matter what's written down in the requirements. If the customer doesn't like it, I haven't done the right thing. So you get into this really important world where the solution starts to be subjective and emergent, i.e. you don't really know what the right answer is until you start to put stuff together and stick it in front of people. There was a great quote from Henry Ford, which says, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. And I think a lot of the world we're in now is like that. Actually, the customer doesn't really know what they wanted. You're able to stick something in front of them and say, well, is this right? Should it be there? Should the button be there? And so on and so forth. So you move from a world of how can I build widget A better to a world of saying, how can I extract the most value from widget A by making my decisions faster than my competitors? From an engineering world to a very product customer focused world. So look, let me pause there, because that is kind of my view of the last 4,000 years of project management, and more importantly, how has the world changed in the last 20 years from an engineering to a product mindset. Any questions at this point? Anyone want to sort of make any observations or any thoughts? Tell me I'm wrong.
We've not had any more chat. But if anybody does want to take this as an opportunity, please either come on video or raise your hand and we can try and invite you on. I love that quote, by the way, the Henry Ford quote. Yeah. If I'd asked my customers, they'd say we want faster horses. And
I see you've got Steve Carroll's turned on his video, and I expect he has something to contribute.
Hi, Steve.
Hi there. You talk about C-suite and you talk about Agile, and in recent years, and I'm a fan of project management. I'm a fan of Agile, but I have found increasingly, as people get excited about Agile, the concept of what I call Agile with a small a, C-suite getting excited about, you mean fast, quick, and cheap, and using it as an excuse not to have proper project governance. Whereas, Agile and Waterfall, as you call it, I think go hand in hand, and you find the right balance of both. But I am finding it increasingly with my clients that they will refer to Agile as something that means they don't have to do quite as much governance, maybe not quite as much documentation, and basically get things cheaper and quicker. I wondered if that was your experience, Adam. I mean,
it's a bit of how long is a piece of string, because I think a lot of different businesses have very different approaches. I tend to find, so when I go out and talk to companies about Agile, and particularly scaled Agile, I very rarely have to explain what it is. I almost always have to explain to them what's gone wrong in their company when they're trying to implement it. So I tend to talk about, you've probably tried this, it's probably gone wrong. Let's talk about how it tends to go wrong. And as you say, probably always the first place it tends to go wrong is people have assumed it means there's no control whatsoever and they can do whatever they want. And it's usually, I hate to say this, it's usually the dev teams who've got all excited about actually not having to pay attention to the project managers, and they've kind of started to do their own thing. I actually find Agile more controlling than Waterfall. So my background is really PMOs. I tend to run sort of big PMOs and portfolio offices. And if you go back 5 years, the concept of an Agile PMO was absolutely anathema. If you even walked and talked about it, you'd be thrown out of the building. When I go in there talk now, actually, people really want to hear about, well, actually, what does Agile control mean? And it has a really strong background even in the Agile Manifesto, where they talk about, actually, we do value documentation, but we just value this other stuff slightly more. I personally find, actually, if Agile is done right, I have far better early warning of if a project or program is going wrong than if you've got it in the Waterfall world, because with the Waterfall, I don't really know if this thing's going to work or not right until the end. So some clients think it's about, we're going to throw out control. I very rarely find the C-suite like that, though. The C-suite don't like Agile because they think it means that. When you kind of explain to them, well, actually, this should give you much better visibility of what's going on, actually, and get your people much closer to customers, they get a much more comfortable about it. So, there are a lot of illusions out there about Agile and about Waterfall, quite frankly. I do find if you explain it properly and you can kind of really explain how it's all supposed to work together from the top to the bottom, people tend to calm down a bit.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the C-suite of big companies tend to react differently to the C-suite of growing companies where they've been very entrepreneurial. And Agile is a great word for them. But I think you've nailed it. It's about explaining what it is, isn't it?
It really is. And actually, just a very final thought on that. I find it really interesting when you talk to entrepreneurial companies, because when they're going from like 5 to 50 people and they're doing really good stuff, they don't even really understand why they need project management, because they are so intuitively agile. They're doing it all right. They are so close to the customer. They are so kind of tied into what the customer needs that they are just doing all this stuff properly without any form of codification around it. It's as they start to grow bigger that you have to explain, well, actually, now you're not all sitting in the same room anymore. So how are you going to coordinate this stuff? So it's all about, I think, trying to create this entrepreneurial structure in organizations that, quite frankly, can't be truly entrepreneurial anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Adam, for that answer as well. We've got a couple of points and a question. I'll go over the points first, actually. So David Richardson, he says, absolutely agree. There's much more assurance in Agile if done properly. And Luke Reader mentions Agile also acknowledges the reality that we don't know the exact shape of a good solution when we start out. So a couple of points there. And a question from Lahadinsky. I hope I've said that right. Apologies if not. But the question is, if we are to deliver what the customer needs rather than what they ask for, how do we capture their needs?
So I will give you the Agile answer. You begin by asking them what they think they need, but then you make sure you are delivering that in small chunks of activity so that you don't putting too much effort into each step of creation. And then you can very quickly stick in front of them what they think they wanted. You also aren't just relying on the customer, of course. You are relying on experts in this space. You are relying on the research community. You are relying on people doing visioning activity. So the customer is really only one source of what the new solution might look like. You're trying to triangulate all those things together to create an idea of what they might actually want. It's not the customer who has the final say in Agile, it's the individual, the product owner, and the customer is an incredibly important source of what they get. But they're also supposed to be drawing from different areas. To be fair, Waterfall has the same answer. So we'll ask the customer, but we're also going to talk to all sorts of people to try and work out what that end state is. I think the challenge with Waterfall is it's much longer before you start to see what that thing you are creating is. You know, you're almost certainly wrong, because actually that is life. You need to get these things in front of people as quickly as you can to work out what the right answer is.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very good answer. And David Richardson just come back with another point. I'm not sure what this means, but I'll read it as I see it. Gemba, and then go and see what their problems are, not what they say they are.
Yeah, hey, that's a really good point. In fact, one of the, I'm turning into an absolute Agile evangelist. I don't mean to be. We actually do quite a lot of Waterfall work. And I think there are some really good places where good old-fashioned Waterfall design works. It's just because Agile ties in kind of where I think a lot of digitalization is going. It's something I'm going to talk about a lot in this particular thing. So please don't think I'm trying to kind of brainwash you. But what David's referring to as a really important technique, which is basically just go out and see what's going on in the real world, where the problems are that your solution is supposed to fix. Because guarantee if you see this problem space you're operating in, the solution space you're operating, you have a much better idea of what the solution needs to be, rather than just taking people's feedback. And by the way, that applies to everything, pretty much anything in life. If you go and have a look at things and see what's happening rather than relying on second and third hand knowledge, you have a much better chance of getting a working solution. Shall I crack on? Because we will probably explore some of this over the next half hour. Right. Okay. So that is the past. Let's talk now about the future. Okay, so I think the trouble with the future is there's so much stuff that could be going on out there. Your problem is, how do you kind of group it into a way that kind of makes sense? So this is my attempt to do. And I think that there are a range of things that are happening out there, and some of them are psychological, i.e. we have a better understanding of how the human works, we the humans work, and we who work as groups and the like, that drives how we want to try and do change. And some of it is technological, i.e. there is improvement in how we use technology. So what I'm going to talk about now is really 4 trends, 2 of them psychological and 2 of them technological. So let's start with a technological solution for, and I use the phrase here, enhancing effectiveness. And what I mean by that is, how do change management, project management, if you boil it down to its absolute brass tacks, is really about making decisions, making better decisions. If I can make the right decisions over what we're going to build, if I can make the right decisions over what's potentially going to go wrong so I can avoid it, if I can make the right decisions over a series of milestones, activity, the amount of money I need to put in, all sorts of stuff, if I can get better at making decisions around that, I get better at delivering projects. And in the past, what we've basically relied on is, are you 40? Have you been doing this for 40 years? Have you got experience of doing this in a particular sector? Let me have a look at your CV. Great, you are probably going to be a better decision maker than someone who doesn't have any experience. So our approach to better decision making is basically about trying to find a better human to do that decision making. You start to look at what is happening in the world of data science. In fact, has been happening for the last kind of 20, 30 years. We're getting really very good at using large bodies of data to help us make decisions. And the easiest thing I can use to exemplify that is Amazon, and the way its algorithms will present stuff that you might like to buy. So if you think about what's going on there, they are looking about a huge stash of data, both about what you're looking about, what your near neighbors are looking about, what people like you are looking about, and so on, and they're bringing all that together in an algorithm and saying, well, actually, you will probably like this and this and this. If we look at projects, they are essentially just a mass of data. And if we're really clever about this stuff, we should be able to look at that data, apply similar algorithms to try and understand what that data is telling us. When you're working on a small project where there's a small amount of data, this is less useful, and actually probably the human is much more available to look at that and look for patterns, because the brain is a pattern recognition tool, and find areas of concern. But as you start to scale up your projects to program level, particularly at portfolio level, the difficulty becomes, how do we as humans know where things are likely to go wrong? And we're starting to see more and more really interesting tools in the analytics space, which are allowing us, sorry, that's my daughter going out to bed, which are allowing us to really understand where things are likely to go wrong. Now, this is really common. This is really common already in a number of sectors. So the classic one I always use is in the financial sector. When you're looking at fraudulent bank credit card transactions. And what tends to happen in that space is a bank builds itself a data set, builds itself a tool, and it looks at all the examples of credit card fraud that it's aware of over the last 10 years. And it looks at what the variables, what the factors that occurred when those credit card frauds occurred. So it occurred late at night. It occurred in a strange place in the world. It occurred from a strange named thing or a strange card or whatever it is. So there are a lot of factors that tie to the fraudulent credit card transaction. You could do that because that's a massive data set. Then all it does is it sets the system going, and then going forward, whenever those variables trigger over a certain level, the thing gets flagged as a credit card fraud, and you hunt it down. Now you can apply that exact same concept to project management, because essentially milestone reporting is really just the same sort of estimate. If I take a reasonably sized data of milestone reports around a major program, I can look at what are the variables that have driven fraudulent milestone estimates. By fraudulent, I mean somebody said this was green and it wasn't, it turned red. So I can use my tool to find out where all of those kind of what the fraudulent variables are for these kind of dodgy milestone reports, and then I apply that going forward. So actually, as new milestone reports start to come in, the tool's looking for those variables and it flags areas of concern, and it says project manager X is implying that that milestone in 6 months' time is green. We think it's really suspect. We think it has a low level of confidence of being successful. And that's just one really kind of noddy example. And you can do that with those techniques called sort of random forest analysis, which are able to use data sets of moderately sized projects and programs. But I've got to say, this is just the beginning. The sort of stuff that I've seen being done with really aligned data sets and with really advanced kind of toolage is really quite spectacular. So my first future trend, is something we should all start to be more and more aware of, is the power of analytics to enhance our ability to make good decisions around projects and programs, identifying areas of risks, identifying areas of cost overrun, identifying areas where we should be applying more focus. And I genuinely think more and more we're going to start to see data scientists as just standard members of PPM communities in organizations, in the same way that data scientists are quite naturally now standard members of the operational teams. You know, if you look at some of the big GSK, for instance, has a whole team of data scientists who pull over their operations to kind of refine stuff and look for errors. It'll just become normal to pull that across and use that in the change space. So enhancing the effectiveness of decision making, enhancing the effectiveness of people in the projects to make the right decisions over what might go right and what might go wrong. The second trend, again in the technology space, is what I call enhancing efficiency. And really, this is nothing more than harnessing automation and the power of automation. One of the really fundamental things I think that's happened over the last 5 years is the accessibility of really effective automation tools. So if you went back 5, 6, 7 years, if I wanted to automate the processes in my organization, I'd have to go outside, hire a very big expensive company who'd come in, crawl over my processes, align them, and then automate the whole thing. And then they'd have to stay on staff to kind of keep that running every 5 minutes as it broke. These days, I have access to, I call it Flow there, it's actually kind of called Power Automate now. So Microsoft has its own tool called Power Automate, which is its automation tool. UiPath is freely available. These are all tools that we can access, and with a small amount of tailoring, which is often free online, can help us understand how to automate the processes we create. An awful lot of stuff in the project management world, in the PMO world particularly, is about standardizing processes so that we can pull information from out in the project space, so we can analyze that information, we can make decisions about it. The more standardized those are, the easier it is, the more automated it is, the lower cost it is, the higher effectiveness it is, the higher efficiency it is, and the higher quality it is, actually, because actually you start to strip out the human error. One of the things, we alluded to the APM award earlier, one of the things that we've done with all of our, whether you're a project manager or a tester or whatever in my company, is put them through basic Power Automate training. Because it really is, I think it's what Excel and PowerPoint were 5 years ago. It's just the new tool that we're all going to have to get a grip on, be able to manage to be effective in the workplace. And then you can land anywhere into any space you're working, and you can start to design the processes you want to run your organization, and you can automate them and fire them away, and off they go. It really is quite extraordinary stuff. So I think my absolute second trend is using technology, using the power of automation to simplify and improve a whole range of processes that we start to implement in the change in the project. Now, obviously, there's a huge link between automation and analytics, and in fact, when I'm talking about it, I almost always talk about it in the same breath, because the two tie in so nicely together. Automation will pull the information in, make sure it's clean. Analytics will then look at that information and help us understand what might be going wrong and where we need to apply our attention. Both of those things go hand in hand. What's not hugely yet, I don't think, is I'm not yet seeing those worlds brought together in project management tools hugely effectively. I would be amazed if in the next 2 years someone doesn't drop a really cool new project change management tool, which basically has a lot of both the automation but also the analytics capability in it as standard. So you don't need any particular special training. It'll just go in there and help you navigate your project and program management. Both really exciting, both really interesting. But at its heart, change and project management is a people challenge. It's almost always about, can I manage my people? Can I get my teams to do the right stuff, to bring stuff to my attention if it's going wrong? Can I make people comfortable about what I'm asking them to do because they're changing their day-to-day job, or they're using a new IT system, or they're buying a new thing? Basically, the psychology side is really hugely important. And actually, psychology is my background. My first degree and master's was in psychology, and I've waited 20 years to actually apply it. So I'm really excited now to be able to talk about psychology in the world of project management. But there's two really interesting trends here. So I think the first is, if anyone's been involved in a large-scale program, particularly when it's an organizational redesign, the number one thing, in my opinion, that stops that thing being successful is the amount of pushback you get from the organization to any change. We hate change. People do not like change. We want to know that tomorrow is pretty much the same as today. We particularly hate change in organizations where we are feeling uncomfortable, nervous, where there's a very sort of structured reward system that we need to be able to navigate. The book you see there is called Fearless Organization by a lady called Amy Edmondson, who's at Harvard, I think. But it's a fascinating book, and it basically talks about the advantages of creating an organization where people have psychological safety. That's a word you're going to hear more and more of as we go on, just in industry in general. Psychological safety basically says there is very little margin in making people scared to get more work out of them. It just doesn't really work. It makes them clamp down. It makes them uninventive, and particularly when you get into the sort of digital world, the world where success is driven by innovation, fear just destroys innovation. You start to see a real link between Amy Edmondson's work around psychological safety and actually a lot of the work you see around digitalization and how to kind of be a challenger brand out there, because a lot of it is about how do you drive innovation in your teams? How do you free them up to be successful? In the world of change, I think there's something quite important about us when we deliver change, being accepting of the fact that change is scary. And when we go out and try and change organizations, we need to be really aware of the fact that people don't like change. And that can really damage what we're trying to do. And at absolute nub, I think it's as simple as actually change readiness assessments and actually trying to gauge the mood of the organization and whether we've really properly helped them accept this change. There's a lot of different terms for it, but you see a lot of people classed as business change management. That's very much about getting people ready for the change that's going to come. At its higher level, I actually genuinely think there's a role for the PMO or some central function. In fact, I use the phrase town hall PMO. The idea being that PMO's job is to gauge the stress of the organization, to actually help them deal with it, and to be a place of communication. Because the best way to overcome stress and fear of change is to share information, to give people as much transparency and visibility as what's going on. And I talk about the concept of the town hall PMO, the idea that the PMO is the place that people can gather into and around to understand what's going on, to ask questions, to feel welcoming. Hugely important, particularly when you're doing organizational change. And we're only really scratching the surface of how much stress and fear stops us changing. And the final trend I'm going to talk about is, oh, sorry, I went backwards and I meant to go forwards. There we go. The final trend I wanted to talk about was another psychological one, something called overcoming bias. So there's some really, really interesting thinking about the why we humans are so bad at estimation and why we humans are so bad at change, actually. And a lot of it comes down to our brains really weren't designed for the world we're in at the moment. They're designed for, hunting deer across the savannah, elk across the savannah, sorry, in the cradle of civilization. So there's a lot of reasons why we are particularly bad at project management, particularly bad at estimation. And I'm sure many of the people on this call would have read Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is absolutely masterwork. If you've not read it, you absolutely must read it. But it basically talks about all of these kind of things that are perfectly reasonable. There's perfectly good reasons why we operate in this way, but operating this way makes us really bad at changing. And it's sort of stuff like lock-in, and that we don't like. Once we put money into a project that's going wrong, we don't like to can it because we assume that money before is kind of still there. Or it's about sort of optimism bias, whereby we always assume that something's going to come in faster and cheaper for more benefit than it actually does, and it always overruns and always it costs more, and so on and so forth. How do we combat that? Well, there's a couple of really interesting bits of thinking. The guy I always sort of point to is a chap called Ben Flubier, who is the BT Professor of Major Program Management at Oxford University. And his big thing is something called reference class forecasting, which actually is a Danny Kahneman idea. But basically, it sounds very clever. It's basically saying, look, if you get a bunch of experts in the room, it doesn't matter what's on their CV, they are not going to be particularly great at estimating how long this thing's going to take. Take a reference class. I look at 20, 30, 40 of similar projects that have occurred in the past, work out how many they overran by, work out how much they overcosted by, and then use those two reference points, i.e. the big reference class and what the experts are saying, to come to an agreement on what it's likely to be. Basically saying, take another outside point of view that is not just driven by a bunch of experts sitting in a room saying this is the answer. So being aware of those biases, being aware of the facts and the things that make us bad at both predicting change and dealing with change is a hugely important part. And the more change becomes something to do with people, and the more stakeholders' view of the endpoint of change becomes important, i.e. it's going to be the end customer who says if you've done the right thing or not, this stuff becomes absolutely critical. So 4 trends, usually driven around the concept of better decision making, enhancing effectiveness through analytics, enhancing efficiency through automation, of overcoming stress through an understanding of the fearless organization, the damage that stress and fear does to change, and understanding the damage to decision making we get from heurisms and the biases that are innate in all of us. So I think all those things are quite important ways of helping us deliver change better. But I do think there's one other thing that we've actually touched on quite a lot, so it's not going to be a huge surprise when I mention it, but I'm also going to talk here about, for me, the thing that runs through the heart of all this. And I think it's the concept of customer value, stakeholder value. All of this stuff we've talked about there is really about trying to make us make better decisions, make quicker decisions, so that we can deliver something that is better aligned to the value of the customer at the end of it all. I always throw the Agile word in here because, I mean, Agile is pretty much designed around the concept of making sure what you're building is as close to the customer as possible. But the Agile organization is very much about kind of, yes, you'll have a hierarchy. You need a hierarchy to run the business, but hierarchies can stifle innovation. They can create silos, which are selfish in the organization. So you need to try and work out a way of actually making sure the customer view flows through those silos. And there we talk about kind of concepts like scaled Agile, large scale Scrum, the Spotify methodology, which are really ways of doing Agile at scale. But for me, it's really about trying to build organizations that aren't just about give me a requirement, let me build those requirements, but trying to build organizations that put the customer at the heart of that change one is trying to create. Agile is a really interesting way of doing that. I always finish here on the fact that so much, I mean, you guys are so important to the future of change. You guys are so important to the future of industry, actually. I mean, there's just some really interesting thinking, particularly if you look at the product management world, that says that it almost doesn't matter what your company does or creates, what part of government you're in. The thing that's going to make the difference over the next 10 years, and quite frankly, it's made the difference over the last 5 years, is how good that company is, that organization is, about harnessing digitalization to deliver its aim. Because the point is, it doesn't really matter if you make the best, I don't know, shops or funerals or watches in the world. If you haven't got a grip on digitalization, someone who has never done it before but has, is going to come along and eat your lunch. I always use the example of Amazon here. You know, if you asked me 5 years ago who was going to be the greatest, the biggest watch manufacturer in the world, sorry, Apple here. If you asked me 5 years ago who was going to be the biggest watch manufacturer in the world 5 years ago, I would have never said Apple. And yet Apple is now the world's biggest watch manufacturer. The point is, they've got a harness of digitalization. They've got a harness of some of these methodologies, and they use it to eat everybody else's lunch. It doesn't matter what you do as a company. You can't do that, pretty soon someone's going to eat your own lunch. So look, let me pause now for questions before I just do a final slide bringing that all together. So anything if people want to throw at me, anything I've got wrong?
Just in the chat, actually, Nicole Riley mentioned when you were talking about the analytics, data scientists or data analysts, communication of the insights is the key.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I mean, it's almost like working with kind of testers. The best testers in the world can articulate what they're trying to do and work with the rest of the organization to build that. But often you need to have a sort of test manager in there who can articulate what the testers are trying to do so that the rest of the world understands what's going on. And it's kind of similar with data scientists because they get so damn excited about it. You often need someone to be the interpreter between them and the rest of the world. I do think though that's because at the moment data science is kind of this really kind of scary ivory tower type thing, and you have these people in there who are just super excited about it. But that's where project management was, 20 years ago. I do think as we start to break it down, as we start to understand this, as it starts to be just a common activity and just a standard part of business, it won't be an ivory tower, and actually everyone will be able to talk that language. So it'll be much easier to make this stuff relevant to your change space. So Nicole, I know it doesn't even answer your question, but I totally accept it's not just about having data scientists, it's about being able to interpret that stuff. I do think the more it becomes common currency in our change activity, the easier it will be to understand what's going on in that space.
Yeah, great answer. And one more question here actually from Hannah Evans. Hi, Adam. What can you tell us about scaled Agile framework and how it differs from Agile?
How long do you go? I will give you the 30-second answer. So, in my mind, Agile deals with how do you manage a single sprint or Scrum team or a small team to deliver change. Scaled Agile says, let's assume those small teams are delivering fine. How do you coordinate with them? So if you look at SAFe, for instance, and even if you look at something like less, it doesn't really dictate too much what the individual teams are doing in those sort of 2-weekly sprints. It basically says, let's assume those sprints are vaguely working. Now, how do I harness that together? So if I've got 20 teams, they aren't breaking the organization. So in a funny way, the scaled Agile element, when you talk about scaling Agile, the scaled element is almost the controlling element. It says, how do you get these things to work together? And how do you get it aligned to the organizational need? And how do you make sure the customer view flows through all of the individual activities of the individual teams? So really very, 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 very brief kind of look at it. There's all sorts of, in fact, if you go on my website, the P2 Consulting website, I do a talk on introduction to scaled Agile and SAFe, which is about half an hour. So it's free to you, just click on that and it will explain kind of what's going on in the world of SAFe.
Brilliant. Thank you. So Hannah said, yeah, that's great, Adam. Thank you very much. I'm looking more into this very soon. Actually, Simon's just noted there is a lot of methodology, process, analysis, data, etc. in this vision of the future. What's the future of the human project manager?
Yeah, yes, I think that's an excellent question. So in fact, you know what? Let me just do my final slide because I think hopefully that will explore some of that stuff. So I think we stop actually being so much about project management and more about product management. I think we stop being so much about start and finish of a specific thing and start to be much more about there's a particular product I'm worrying about, and there's all these things that I'm going to change to it until it stops delivering value. So there's a big mindset shift. It becomes less, as I say, an engineering challenge and far more of a psychological, sociological type. It's about kind of what does the customer of this product actually want. If you look at bullet point further, I say actually, I think project management, or change management, let's call it that, stops being about IQ and starts being about EQ, emotional quotient. It starts being about one's ability both to understand what customers want and understand how people are feeling in both the team trying to deliver the change and the team receiving the change. Yeah, it's about trying to make sure you really feel for individuals. It's not good enough just to build widget A and throw it at them. It's about understanding why they want widget A, how they're going to use it, are they ready to receive it. So I think ironically psychology, a background in psychology becomes far more useful than a background in engineering for the future of project management.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's it for now for questions. So
go on. I just realized I didn't properly finish the slide because I got so excited about saying that. So let me just do this one properly, if that's okay. So yeah, we talk about project management. I think automation is going to become a basic skill. So check out Power Automate, check out UiPath. They're really easy to use, and I would see them being used like we've used PowerPoint, like we use sort of MS Projects, those planning tools, like we use MS Excel these days. I think it's just become part of the kit you'll expect when you say, I can do this job. I think data scientist is going to become much more prevalent, or data analyst is going to become much more prevalent in the world of change. I think you'll see a change data scientist being just a common role that you have in any big change function in an organization. We've talked about EQ, not IQ, and also on that people side, decision-making enablement will become a formal sought-after skill. What do I mean by that? I mean actually trying to organize information in a way that helps busy people make decisions on it. Far too much the role of the project manager has been to throw as much data at the people who've got to make decisions as possible and hope some of it sticks. Far more going forward will be a skill around how do I shape that data, how do I shape the story to help people make a decision on it. So I think that's going to become a really, really big part of what we do as project approach. That really is it. So I'm going to stop now. So back to you, Asim.
Brilliant. No, thank you. So Nicole came back with a really good point as well. So those working in the decision intelligence space bring a lot of these topics together, particularly the impact of EQ. Yeah. So yeah.
It's a massive area. And we're only just scraping the surface of it. It's going to be so important, not just for change management, actually, for all parts of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, a few more questions have come in. So Lahadinsky, again, I hope I said it correct. So the comment here is, oops, where's it gone? My screen's just changed.
Oh, sorry, I just stopped. I stopped so you could see me.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I found it. So reference to the future direction of project manager. If they start leading the business, what happens to the line of business manager?
So there is a really interesting trend toward what you think of what they call project, what's the phrase they use? I think it's project management organizations. The idea being that you don't actually have a business and a project world, it's all one world doing change. And actually the product management kind of model starts to move towards that, because you're always selling something in the world of business, and actually what you're trying to do is group people around what the best thing to sell is. So the idea of the business manager and the product manager being separate things kind of disappears. Now I have to say I think that's probably a bit too far away, but I do think there's something really important about business managers having done project management and project managers having done business management. I think so much of what we're trying to do in the change world is changing how businesses operate to deliver greater value to customers. The more we understand how businesses operate by having been business managers, the more effective we are as project managers. So I do see those worlds getting much closer together.
Yeah, brilliant. I hope that's answered your question. David Richardson's saying, no traditional project managers in SAFe, but absolutely agree with Adam that a customer-focused project manager will thrive in a safe environment, and the EQ will allow them to make change.
Yeah, I mean, it stops being about reductionism and it starts being about what's the right thing for the people around us. It really is really important.
Yeah. Okay, and one last comment at the moment here, M_T. So no full name, just some initials there. I've been a manager in the healthcare sector and currently transitioning to a career change into project management. There are a few transferable skills, but it seems there is a lot to learn.
There's always a lot to learn, I'm afraid. That's what keeps me coming back.
Yeah, but yeah, there's obviously a lot of training courses within the various industry accredited providers.